While every violent crime is horrendous, there is something particularly chilling about cases where entire groups of people have their lives stripped away, and for the perpetrator to remain at large afterwards. How is it possible that crimes committed in broad daylight, where the innocent lives of numerous people are taken, can go unsolved? Sometimes it seems unfathomable, but in today's episode, we'll be discussing just that as we explore two horrific, unsolved mass murders. The Florence Salon murders. The morning of Tuesday, November 6th, 2001, should have been like any other for the customers and staff of a hair and nail salon named the Hair Gallery, located off Route 93 in the town of Florence, Montana. At 11 a.m., a customer of the Hair Gallery arrived at the salon for her appointment. As she pulled into a space in the parking lot, she noticed somebody leaving out the front door. This struck her as odd, as the salon always used the back door as its main entrance. The customer continued to watch the person leaving the establishment. They appeared to be a man, and they were oddly dressed, wearing a large black duster-style coat and a wide-brimmed hat that was either a top hat or a fedora. After the person strode away, the customer exited her vehicle and went to the main entrance at the back of the salon. There she was greeted by the sight of 62-year-old Dorothy Harris, the salon's owner, lying dead in a pool of her own blood just inside the doorway. Terrified, the customer went to the phone inside and called the authorities. When the police arrived at the scene, they discovered two more bodies in the utility closet in the back room of the salon. The victims were 44-year-old Brenda Patch, the nail technician of the Hair Gallery, and 71-year-old Cynthia Paulus, a customer who had arrived early that morning for her appointment. Each woman had their throats cut. The attack immediately struck investigators as odd, as they struggled to find a motive for the crime. None of the women had been sexually assaulted, and no money had been taken from the scene. Every Tuesday morning, Dorothy, a grandmother who loved to make crafts in her free time, would go to the bank in Stevensville to deposit the money made from the salon. She had deposited this week's cash 30 minutes before her body was discovered, leaving a very narrow window of opportunity for the killer, as the drive back from Stevensville would have taken around 15 to 20 minutes. This led law enforcement to theorize that Brenda had opened up the salon to let Cynthia in, and that they had been killed first. Investigators noted that the utility closet was in disarray, as if a struggle had taken place, and it was determined that both women had likely been forced onto their knees before they were slain. One officer likened the state of the closet to a battle scene. They also believed that the perpetrator had waited for Dorothy to return before taking her life. It has been stated that all three women sustained other injuries outside the cuts to their throats, but the authorities have declined to elaborate on what those injuries are, outside of noting they were not of a sexual nature. Very little evidence was discovered at the scene, and investigators have declined to give details. Looking into the personal lives of all three women, the police failed to find any reason that may have led to their deaths. They were unable to even determine who, if anyone, was specifically targeted. While there has been some speculation that Dorothy was the main focus, since the culprit appeared to have waited for her return, it has been argued that she may have simply stumbled onto the scene and was killed for that reason alone. It has also been theorized that the person responsible for the murders was someone who'd committed a crime of opportunity and picked the women at random. The crime had occurred in broad daylight in a tiny town of fewer than 1,000 residents, where it was commonplace for doors to be left unlocked. Not only did this lead to panic among the residents, but it led to the idea that someone outside the community was responsible, that someone had passed through just to commit the crime and then left. The man who was seen leaving the salon at 11 a.m. is considered a suspect. Investigators believe that the customer who found Dorothy's body had arrived on the scene just minutes after the murders occurred. Furthermore, other witnesses came forward to the authorities following the crime, and stated that they had also seen the oddly dressed man. He is described as being in his 20s or early 30s, with narrow facial features, and is around 6 feet tall. According to local gossip, there is some speculation that the perpetrator is a woman. However, this is unsubstantiated, and law enforcement does not support this theory. Witnesses who saw the man said he was walking with a purpose. Using this lead, the police had scent dogs trace the man's movements. They followed his scent through a nearby alleyway, through a dirt car park off a local restaurant, the Wild River, through several back streets, and then to a school parking lot. The canine lost the scent in a nearby pasture, 4 blocks from the crime scene. However, a second scent dog led the police from the pasture to a nearby home. The resident, however, was physically unable to have carried out the crime and was promptly ruled out of the investigation. One other similar crime then occurred, almost a year later, on September 4th, 2002, although it took place in Great Bend, Kansas, about 1,300 miles from Florence. On the afternoon of the 4th, a customer pulled into the parking lot of the Dolly Madison Cake Discount Bakery at 1004 Harrison Street. The customer immediately noticed a man they didn't recognize locking up outside the front door. He told the customer, as they approached, that the bakery was closed for the day. The customer thought this was odd, since it was early in the day, but thought nothing of it and returned home. Later that evening, however, a delivery driver entered the bakery using the back entrance and was horrified to see 2 dead bodies on the floor. The victims were 24-year-old Mandy Alexander, who'd been an employee for just 3 days, and 79-year-old Mary Drake, a customer. Both women had been stabbed to death. Like the crime in Florence, investigators struggled to find a motive for the deaths of Mandy and Mary. While a small amount of cash had been taken from the register, the bags and purses of the 2 women were left untouched. Neither victim had been sexually assaulted, and law enforcement found nothing in their backgrounds to indicate why they had been targeted. Like the case in Florence, it seemed totally random. The customer who'd seen the man locking up earlier that day helped investigators create a composite sketch, which was distributed throughout the town. It noted that the suspect stood around 6'1", weighed around 175 pounds, was between the ages of 30 and 35, and had light brown or blonde collar-length hair. A worker at a nearby motel recognized the description and told the police about a transient man who'd checked in on the 4th and checked out the following day. The man had shaved his head before leaving. Still, both the transient man and the suspect from the bakery have never been identified. In the years since, law enforcement have stated their belief that the 2 cases are linked, but once more declined to give further details. In 2005, authorities revealed that they'd identified a suspect in the Florence case. Brian Weber, at the time of the crime, had been living in Nampa, Idaho, about 375 miles away. A small-time drug dealer who sold meth, Weber was also an addict himself, which had led to him becoming increasingly violent. He eventually began to engage in petty criminal behavior to help fund his habit. Weber was questioned shortly after the Florence slayings had occurred, and his DNA was taken. During the interview, he was asked if there would be any reason why his DNA might be present at the scene, but he claimed he had not been to the Salon since it had become the hair gallery. The building had previously been used as a post office, and that was the last time he had set foot in it. Later, Weber admitted that he'd been high during questioning, and that he was not sure what he'd been asked or what he'd answered. In 2003, he was arrested for assault following a meth deal gone wrong. In 2004, he was charged with a large number of drug-related offenses and sentenced to 24 years in prison. Throughout the years, Weber has maintained his innocence in relation to the Florence slayings, although police stated that he had made incriminating statements to 2 separate inmates. A police informant, given a wire to wear, attempted to elicit a confession from Weber, but failed because he was made aware of the informant's presence. During this time, his lawyers managed to reduce his sentence to 10 years. Another suspect in the case was a man named Lincoln Benavides, an Idaho-born lifelong drug user. As a teenager, Benavides lived on the streets with his sister, and he began to run into trouble with law enforcement from the age of 13. Like Weber, Benavides began dealing drugs and soon became a career criminal. In 2008, authorities alleged that both men knew each other, and they were responsible for multiple assaults and drug offenses together. The 2 were then charged with the triple murders. The indictment alleged that the slayings were carried out as part of a collection of a drug debt, and that Benavides was the leader of a drug distribution ring which operated throughout Idaho and Montana between 1999 and 2001. It also claimed that Weber worked as a violent enforcer for the organization. The indictment read, in part, quote, "On occasion, Weber would threaten other dealers or beat them in order to facilitate the collection of money for the organization. On occasion, Brian Weber and Lincoln Benavides would together threaten or beat someone." Little evidence was revealed at the time. Authorities stated that much of the detail in the case would be revealed during the trial. It was emphasized that Benavides had little to do with the murders himself, but that he, quote, "counseled, commanded, induced, or procured the killings of victims." The indictment also noted that both men had left the state shortly after the murders had occurred. Benavides left the US entirely, returning to Texas a few months later. Before the trial began, however, Benavides took a plea deal. The murder charges against him were dropped, and he was sentenced to 25 years behind bars for drug offenses. It took longer for Weber to be cleared, but in 2010, the charges against him were also dropped, when it was discovered he was not actually in Montana at the time of the murders. This alibi, and the fact that the prosecution's only reliable witness, as most of them were inmates and criminals, died in 2008, led to the case falling apart. In 2018, Weber was sentenced to 15 years in prison for drug-related offenses, followed by 10 years of supervised release. The indictment of Weber and Benavides has been heavily criticized in the years since, as it appears the prosecutors built an incredibly flimsy case, and many suspect that local law enforcement had attempted to railroad the two men into falsely confessing while under pressure to solve the case. There have been no further arrests or charges in the years since Weber and Benavides were cleared, and there has been no known progress in the case in recent times. The Florence Salon murders are still unsolved. If you have any information about the case, you can contact the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office at 406-375-4024. The Annecy Shootings. At 3:45 p.m. on September 5, 2012, 25 shots were fired on a lay-by road near Chevelines in France, near the southern end of Lake Annecy. A British former RAF pilot named Brett Martin stumbled across a gruesome scene while cycling across the other side of the river. He didn't hear the gunshots due to the sound of the water, and instead came across the bodies while on his normal route. He first spotted 7-year-old Zainab Al-Hili, who was miraculously still alive. It was later found that she had been shot in the shoulder before being bashed across the head with a gun. The young girl stumbled out onto the road and collapsed in front of her parents' BMW. The vehicle was locked, its engine still running, and bullet holes penetrated the windows. Inside, there were 3 dead adults: 50-year-old Saad Al-Hili, his wife, 47-year-old Iqbal, and her mother, 74-year-old Suhaila Al-Alaf. Saad and Iqbal were Iraqi-born British nationals, while Suhaila held a Swedish passport. The BMW had been sharply reversed into the lay-by, leaving visible marks on the road, and it was still in reverse gear when Brett arrived on the scene. Its rear wheels spun in loose sand. Each victim had been shot twice in the head. There was one more body lying in the road. Sylvain Mollier, a 45-year-old Frenchman who'd been out cycling when he was caught in the crosshairs. He had been shot 7 times. The Al-Hili's youngest daughter, who was just 4, was discovered by forensic investigators under the legs of her dead mother. She'd been in the rear footwell for 8 hours, but was physically unharmed. It was soon determined, after analysis of the cartridge cases and butt plate fragments, that the crime had been carried out using a Luger P06 semi-automatic pistol. It fired 7.65 by 21mm parabellum ammo with an 8-round magazine, and is generally considered a collector's item, though it was previously known to be exported to the US and was adopted by the Swiss Army for some time. It is described as a weapon which isn't very powerful, but is extremely accurate and reliable. The investigation into the shooting, which left 4 people dead and 1 child injured, was carried out by the Criminal Investigation Department and Forensic Science Department of the French National Gendarmerie, although in September of 2012, a joint task force between the British and the French was set up in an effort to progress the case. very little useful evidence was discovered at the scene, which itself is described as a picnic spot. What clues law enforcement could find from the scene led to conflicting theories. On one hand, the precise execution-style killings and the callous attempt to murder a child felt cold and professional. On the other hand, the perpetrator had left behind 21 shell casings and had used a very distinct and uncommon weapon. Much like the Florence case we discussed earlier, investigators working on the Annecy shooting struggled to find an obvious motive. For some time, it was theorized that 50-year-old Saad was the main target of the attack, that his family were collective damage, and that Sylvain was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Saad and Iqbal had been living in the UK for over 20 years, with Saad working as an engineer and Iqbal a dentist. The couple's neighbors and friends had nothing but good things to say about the family. Saad, by all accounts, was a doting father, while Iqbal was a devoted wife and mother. There were rumors during the initial investigation that the father of two worked around some sensitive topics due to his career. A French newspaper named Le Monde alleged that Saad had access to a Swiss bank account that belonged to Saddam Hussein's political party. The paper claimed that they had obtained this information from the German Secret Service. However, there is no evidence to connect Saad to Saddam Hussein. The Swiss bank account that has been linked to the 50-year-old is actually his father's. Saad's father, Kadim, was a lawyer and businessman who moved the family to the UK in 1971 after his brother was arrested by Iraq's intelligence agency and vanished for a year. When he returned, he had slurred speech and brain damage, which prompted Kadim to move his family to safety. While the family moved, Kadim returned to Iraq in 1974 to continue running his businesses. He retired in 1982, moving permanently to the UK. When he passed away, he left behind $1 million in a Swiss bank account for his two sons, Saad and Zaid, as well as properties in England and Spain. Following his passing, the two brothers began to argue about who should get what. This disagreement was still ongoing when Saad was killed. Upon learning all this information, authorities turned their attention to Zaid, believing he had a motive to want his brother dead. Zaid, for his part, didn't believe Saad was a victim of a professional hit. He noted that it would have been easier for anyone who wanted him dead to have carried out the crime while he was in the UK, where he had a routine and a home, and that Saad never had access to sensitive information on his job. Still, on September 28th, just weeks after the shooting, law enforcement arrived at Zaid's home with a search warrant. While they'd been investigating the crime scene, detectives had discovered that Saad owned a taser, a weapon that is illegal to possess in the UK. While they felt this indicated the 50-year-old feared for his safety and that of his family, when speaking with other family members, they discovered that Saad had reportedly said he was afraid of his brother. Still, although his home was searched, authorities found nothing connecting Zaid to his brother's death. Despite this lack of evidence, law enforcement continued to pursue Zaid as a suspect, questioning him repeatedly over the course of the next 7 or 8 months. Some interviews he attended lasted as long as 8 hours, and in June of 2013, he was summoned as a witness in France. Zaid refused to attend. Later that month, he was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder, with investigators suspecting he killed his brother so that he would be the sole beneficiary of their father's estate. However, the case quickly fell apart, as there was still no evidence connecting Zaid to the crime. Zaid continued to maintain his innocence and suggested that Sylvain was the true target of the attack. Sylvain was a divorced father of 3 who worked as a welder at a factory which crafted components for nuclear reactors. The 45-year-old's career choice led to wild speculation that he and Saad knew one another and that the two were in cahoots. However, there is no evidence to support these suggestions. Authorities have found no evidence to indicate Sylvain was the main target, and this lack of motive and evidence has led to the idea that the 4 adults were killed by a lone psychopath, someone who killed for the sake of killing, with no motive and no specific target in mind. This is supported by the fact that neither Sylvain nor the Al-Hili family intended on being on that road at the time of the shootings. Sylvain had been out on a bike ride using a route that had been suggested by his girlfriend's father, but he had gotten lost and somehow turned around on the way. Similarly, the Al-Hili family had only decided that morning to go for a walk, and they had been given directions by a local, but had gotten lost along the way. Going with the lone psychopath theory, Law enforcement cross-referenced military records with psychiatric visits, but found nothing of use. In April of 2014, while going through a list of everyone Sylvain's girlfriend knew, they came across a man named Patrice Menegaldo. Detectives called him in for an interview, which lasted an hour. They hoped he might have been privy to some information about Sylvain that they had not seen. Patrice was a 50-year-old former paratrooper in the French Foreign Legion, but appeared to have no useful information about the cyclist. 2 months after his interview, he took his own life. The note he left behind read in part that he couldn't handle being a suspect in a murder. This struck investigators as odd, as they had never named him as a suspect or even a person of interest. They had not treated him as such either, and overall had no reason to think he was involved. His sudden suicide, however, led to some speculation that he was the lone psychopath. After all, he had a military background and was mentally unwell. Still, many find it odd that he waited 2 months before taking his own life, if he was truly the perpetrator and was scared of getting caught. It's unknown what other information his last letter contains, as it has never been made public, understandably. There is no evidence tying Patrice to the murders. 1 month later, in July of 2014, it came to light that Saad's wife, Iqbal, had briefly married an American police officer in 1999. The pair had quickly split up, and only a few people knew of their marriage. 7 hours after the demise of Sylvain and the Al-Healy family, the former police officer, James Thompson, told a friend that he wasn't feeling well. He died of a massive coronary while driving home. While there was nothing suspicious about James's death, he was unhealthy and unwell. The bizarre timing of the death caused even investigators in France to give pause. The final theory in the Annecy shootings is that a child rapist and killer named Nordal Lelandais was involved. In 2022, Lelandais was convicted for the 2017 murder of an 8-year-old girl, the sexual assaults of 2 young girls, and the murder of a young man who'd been hitchhiking. However, there has been no firm link made between Lelandais, an ex-soldier, and the mass slayings. Furthermore, it seems almost odd, given his history, that he'd leave the 2 children alive. In 2021, a reconstruction of the family's last known movements was made. In January of this year, a motorcyclist who'd been interviewed back in 2015 was brought in for questioning again. This man, who has not been publicly named, lives in Lyon and is in his late 50s. However, shortly after he was taken in, he was released, and the authorities announced that he had been ruled out of the investigation. The case remains unsolved. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.